Good morning, Ms. Clegg. This is the Transportation Committee staff. Hope all is well. I can see you quite clearly, ma'am. Would you mind giving us a quick audio?
As a reminder, please keep your microphone muted unless speaking. Should I hear any added inadvertent background noise, I will request that the member please mute the microphone. To insert a document into the record, please have your staff email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I will now proceed with my opening statement by welcoming you to today's hearing. Today, we will examine the roadway safety crisis, how to save lives, and explore difficult work necessary to achieve zero deaths, on our nation's roads. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that nearly 4,300 people are killed on our roadways, were killed on our railroads in 2021. We owe it to these victims to remember that each number represents a family torn apart by tragedy. We are moving in the wrong direction. Traffic fatalities have increased 19% since before the pandemic. And remember, during the pandemic, many people were at home and not even on the road. Deaths among people walking and biking have increased by 62% in the last decade. The data show that African Americans are disproportionately killed in traffic-related crashes, and crashes are the leading cause of death for our children and teens. In 2019, this subcommittee held a hearing on roadway safety to gather recommendations on what actions Congress should take in the in the surface transportation bill to save lives. And we heard what is not working, loud and clear, For too long, we have accepted preventable traffic deaths as inevitable, prioritized speed over safety, and focused solely on moving cars quickly. I'm proud to say that several of the changes discussed at that hearing became key elements of the committee's Invest in America Act. And some changes survived in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which will shift the focus to safe mobility for all. Today, we will hear from stakeholders again on how to plan and use the tools of the Infrastructure Jobs Act to turn the tide on needless roadway deaths. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is much stronger on roadway safety than any previous service transportation law has been. It provides states and local governments key policy direction and historic funding to invest in roadway safety. States and local partners now have the responsibility to think creatively, invest wisely, and begin to make real change. However, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act also continues a long-standing yet little discussed reality of federal highway funding, that states have significant discretion to choose how to spend that money, including the ability to transfer safety program funds to other uses. I am pleased that Mr. Wilson is with us today to discuss how states will ensure that money is used to save lives. The rhetoric around traffic safety has finally begun to change. Transportation leaders now acknowledge the shared responsibility to build roads that are safer for everyone. But words alone are not enough. We must take concrete steps to design, build, and rebuild roads that prioritize the safety movement of people regardless of how they move. I hope that with redoubled commitment today, we will not be having the same conversation years from now. Thank you to each of our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. At this point, I would like to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Davis, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I would ask before I give my opening statement if the members of this committee and Madam Chair, you would bear with me to honor somebody who's leaving us this week. He's somebody who has been a long-time staffer to our ranking member, Sam Graves, and his name's Paul Sass. Paul is the staff director of the T&I Committee Republicans, and I can't think of somebody who has done a better job over the last few years in this position than has Paul. Paul started out working with Sam when Sam was a newly elected member of Congress a few years ago, and frankly, was the third choice of Sam Graves to be his staff assistant. And Paul went from that job. Obviously, he exceeded expectations, kind of like Garrett Graves does on a regular basis too here. But Paul Sass worked his way up in that office, showed the loyalty, the determination, and also just the drive to be able to succeed, and helped that new member of Congress, Sam Graves, go from a freshman member to being the ranking member of one of the largest committees in Congress. And as I speak on behalf of all of the members on this side of the aisle, on the subcommittee and on the full committee, Paul Sass has done a phenomenal job getting our opinions, asking us what we should do, asking us what our ideas are when it comes to legislating. That's the type of person Paul Sass was, and it's also the example that he set for the people over here that are left to take the reins that he's given them. So Paul, thank you for being a part of this committee's operations. Thank you for being somebody who we've all been able to turn to for advice, and also somebody who we could voice our frustrations to. Paul, you've done a great job here. You put a great team together. And now, hopefully, Jack Ruddy won't screw it up. So, with that, I do want to go to my opening statement, and I'm kidding about that, Jack. You're going to do a great job. Chair Norton, thank you again. I'm really happy to see our witnesses in person today. I think this is one more step in getting us back to some sense of normalcy here in the People's House. I thank you for being here today to talk about this very important matter. We had expected that increase. We had expected that, as Chair Norton mentioned, that the increase in traffic fatality rate in 2020 was a one-year anomaly, resulting from an increase in dangerous driving and, frankly, a lack of enforcement during the coronavirus pandemic. However, NHTSA estimates that the number of traffic fatalities in 2021 increased by 10.5% to 42,915, a 16-year high. The safety of our transportation system is paramount, and it's important that we gather feedback on how our safety programs are working and best practices we should consider. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution to get to zero roadway deaths. Each state, locality, and functional roadway class has unique safety risks. IJA provided historic resources for programs that should increase safety in our transportation system. It provided $15.5 billion, representing a 34% increase in funding and a funding level for the HSIP program, a very flexible core highway program that funds projects that reduce traffic deaths and injuries. In addition, IJA created a new $5 billion program called Safe Streets and Roads for All. This program provides planning and implementation funds to local and tribal governments to increase safety on local roads with a focus on vulnerable road users. Although the purchasing power of this historic investment is not what it was thought it would be, given also the historic inflation rate, but we need to make sure funding is used efficiently and effectively. And with that, again, I want to say thank you to our witnesses for being here with us this morning. I look forward to hearing their testimony on this very important topic. And Madam Chair, I yield back, and thank you for giving me the chance to talk about Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, reflecting on the remarks of the ranking member on the subcommittee, I mean, this shows that the concern about safety and the extraordinary increase in fatalities year over year, largest single annual ever recorded since we started keeping these statistics. He mentioned the same things that I was going to talk about, the HSIP program, complete streets, the additional investments we're making. We are going to give states and localities tremendous flexibility in solving their problems. But let's be clear, this money needs to be invested to resolve these problems. I mean, for years, all we emphasized was fast throughput for cars and trucks. And that ignored a lot of factors that were having to do with safety. And as congestion increased and number of cars increased on the roads, even that was problematic in terms of additional deaths. And then the large increase in pedestrian cycling deaths, that in part is what we're hoping to do with complete streets. We're kind of pathetic in terms of our world ranking, 64th in fatalities per capita on our roadways in America. You're twice as likely to be killed on the road as in Canada, just over the border, 4 times more likely than in leading countries in Western Europe. So that says a lot about our road design and other issues that we have to deal with. And, one size, as the ranking member noted, will not fit all, but we want everybody to identify these areas where they are experiencing high fatalities and use these federal funds to invest and fix it, get it done. That's very, very key. The second thing I wanted to raise is another issue of safety, which doesn't quite fit into that category, and that is truck parking. The House version of the infrastructure bill included $1 billion for truck parking. There is an absolutely critical shortage of truck parking. And there were, over a 4-year period, we don't have, a compilation comprehensively, but there were 2,300 crashes involving parked trucks, 138 fatalities, because the trucks are having to park on the roadside and in areas that are not, designed for safe truck parking. We're also having issues in work zones where we've seen a significant number of increases there. And these things have to be dealt with. But in terms of the truck parking, yesterday, the ranking member, Sam Graves, joined me in a letter to the Secretary asking them to find a way to use some of their discretionary money, and they got out of the Senate drafted version of the bill a great deal of discretionary money for safe truck parking. It's not only that they're parked unsafely, it discourages people from getting into the profession. It is very inefficient. If you have to plan, and you're like, I could drive another hour, but I don't think the next truck stop has any parking spaces for me, so I'm gonna have to stop early, or you get to that next one, and you're about to run out of time, and there's no place to park your truck. So you get two choices. You keep driving, violating hours of service, or you park unsafely. We've got to do something about this, and I hope that the administration will use the discretion they have to deal with that, in addition to all the other tools we're talking about here for the states and localities to reduce fatalities on the road. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Now, I would like, it is time to hear from the witnesses. And I would like to welcome them to I would like to welcome our witnesses today. The Honorable Elaine Clegg, City Council President, Boise, Idaho, on behalf of the National League of Cities. Mr. Sean Wilson, Secretary, Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, on behalf of the American Association of Highway and Transportation Officials. The Honorable Ludwig P. Gaines, Executive Director, the Washington Area Bicycle Association. And Mr. Billy Hadaway, Principal, Fair and Pease, along with Mrs. Cindy Williams, President, Time Stripping, Inc., Board of Directors, member, American Traffic Safety Services Association, on behalf of the American Traffic Safety Services Association. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included into the record. Since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. I'm ready to proceed with testimonies. Ms. Clegg, you may proceed for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to represent America's cities, towns, and villages. This hearing is critical to all cities, to every district, and all the places we call home. As you have read and heard already today, America's annual roadway death toll is growing at staggering rates. Year after year, we lose entire populations of cities the size of many of our state capitals. That's why we must prioritize safety now together at the federal, state, and local levels. 0 is the only acceptable number of deaths on America's roadways. We know that pedestrian deaths are the highest they've seen in 4 decades and that older Americans are especially vulnerable to these serious crashes. We also know that people walk in every town in America. Road safety is not just a big city issue. The highway running through it is the lifeblood of the economies of the nearly 40 small Idaho towns that I have worked in. But too often design choices on their main streets cause real bloodshed when they divide the town rather than connect it. Too often crashes have maimed and taken the lives of locals simply trying to cross the street. In Idaho, each year, we line up shoes on the state capitol steps representing the pedestrians and bicyclists who have died in crashes in the last 5 years. Like the green Converse shoes with the heart on them from the child in Uvalde that Matthew McConaughey brought to the White House, behind each pair of shoes, row after row, is a life tragically lost, the story of a family left behind. This, though it's difficult to listen to, many of those families are willing to share their stories and their grief. And it brings an urgency that we all need to feel. Federal, state, and local governments must be willing to adjust our rules for road design and speed so we can save lives. Surprisingly, many of the fundamental federal measures and guides of transportation are the reasons that cities and towns can't change our roads more easily to be safer for everyone and meet our safety goals. The existing measures and designs rely too heavily on car throughput prioritized during the era of freeway building. No city or town is just a highway. Main Street America in cities small and large serves much more than that. As we begin this time of great rebuilding of America's infrastructure, we must move quickly together to adopt better measures and designs to take on this crisis. If Congress, state, and local leaders reset our goals and allow safety to be the primary measure, we can task transportation engineers to modernize the foundational cost-benefit measures we use to make our roads safe. This is why cities applaud the focus on safer streets in Congress's bipartisan infrastructure law. For the communities I represent, the new Safe Streets and Roads for All program will finally build direct local safety projects all across the country, including in disadvantaged areas that have needed safety for a long time. The HSIP increase in the law was notable, but will only bring this new safety funding will only be transformational if states work with their local leaders by prioritizing city and town context-sensitive designs and measures of success. Let's put people's lives first. When it comes to our roads, the National League of Cities would like to share 9 opportunities to do just that. Adopt the safe systems approach and build context-sensitive complete streets inside cities and towns, allowing our residents to walk away from crashes. Encourage clarity in infrastructure spending with transparent reporting on how and why federal money is being used and what options are being passed up. Increase support to small and rural local governments that are not staffed or equipped to make transportation upgrades themselves. Expedite delivery of safety data. USDOT's reporting process moves quite slowly in a world that uses real-time information. Measure our progress in meeting our national safety goals and leave behind the practice of using vehicle travel speed as the most important measure. Reconnect a virtuous cycle using federally funded research and updates to foundational transportation decision documents such as MUTCD, and allow MUTCD to deliver consistent signs, lines, and signals without being burdened and inhibiting innovation. Address growing vehicle size and serious incidents. And finally, we should engage America's youth in safety and transportation alongside the international community. As a lifelong transportation nerd, I would love to have more youth looking at transportation as a future career. Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before our next witness provides testimony, I'd like to recognize Representative Graves of Louisiana to say a few introductory words about Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Dr. Secretary Sean Wilson now for about 15 years. And I think we've gone through nights and nights, completely sleepless, going through hurricanes, dealing with all sorts of challenges, and just an honorable man that I really do appreciate the opportunity to work with him. He inherited a heck of a problem, and I'd say probably decades and decades of underinvestment in our infrastructure. And while he doesn't always agree with me, I will say that he's taken on some of our toughest challenges and made some great progress on some of the issues in South Louisiana. I'm very proud to have him as the leader of AASHTO this year, and I want to say again, good man, good friend for a very long period of time, and very, very accomplished and skilled lead of a state DOT. And most importantly, I do call him and Rocky, his wife, my friends. Dr. Sean Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Carter for yet another introduction of Mr. Wilson. Mr. Carter, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. So proud and honored to get a chance to introduce my friend, colleague, and a superhero in Louisiana, Dr. Sean Wilson. Dr. Wilson was appointed Secretary of Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development by Governor John Bell Edwards on January 11, 2016, after more than 10 years of executive service to DOTD. Since his appointment, Dr. Wilson has been a tireless advocate for new revenue, maximizing federal dollars available to Louisiana, advancing a balanced and comprehensive transportation policy for Louisiana, and ensuring the department is more collaborative in its working at every single level. We stay in close communication, especially with the rollout of the infrastructure law and its funding. He has a demonstrated commitment to serving people in Louisiana and building a strong underlying transportation infrastructure that is meant to last. Dr. Wilson earned a BA in Urban and Regional Planning from the University of Louisiana and holds a Master's in Public Administration degree, as well as a PhD in Public Policy from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Southern University. Sean and his wife, Rocky, reside in Lafayette, Louisiana. They have 2 children, Sean Wilson Arsenault, Mike, and Joshua. They recently welcomed their first granddaughter, Layla Rose, and we are so incredibly proud, as you can tell by the dual introductions, the bipartisan introductions, the mutual respect that we have for this incredible leader. Welcome, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. Mr. Wilson, you may proceed.
Thank you, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, Chair DeFazio, and of course the congressman from the district I grew up in, Congressman Carter, and Congressman Graves that I've worked with as a co-worker and as a constituent. It's exciting to be with you today and appear at this very important committee about roadway safety and the crisis facing this country. As Secretary of DOTD and President of AASHTO, we stand with you in this commitment to safety. For far too long, we've seen tragic loss of life on our nation's roads and streets, and the recent significant increase in traffic fatalities is extremely disheartening. The good news is, thanks to your leadership and the Congress that passed the IIJA, we're seeing an increased level of federal support to state DOTs and our local partners as we combine efforts to provide safe, equitable, and sustainable transportation systems for our nation. We're grateful that the IIJA aligns with state DOT and AASHTO priorities by maintaining a strong federal core aid highway program, including the Highway Safety Improvement Program that Chair DeFazio spoke about. The increase in funding and flexibility for HSIP will allow states to expand their efforts to identify and implement roadway improvements that will address daily tragedies occurring on roads, be they state or local. In addition, the new Safe Streets for Roads and Roads for All grant program provides opportunities for states and other stakeholders to work together collaboratively to address traffic safety throughout the planning, design, operation, and maintenance of all public roads. As AASHTO President, I'm leading 2 emphasis areas that are central to our work in roadway safety: creating pathways to equity and partnering to deliver. State DOTs are not only identifying ways to strengthen our commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity with respect to our staffing, organizations, and business practices, we're also working to enhance the decision-making and investment processes and practices to positively impact the transportation network. As we expand our efforts to collaborate with traditional and non-traditional partners, we're continually identifying new opportunities and partnerships to work together to improve safety in every state and every community. These emphasis areas enhance AASHTO's traffic safety efforts by providing a focus on citizens, communities, and neighborhoods that have not historically received the needed safety investment by elevating our partnerships with a range of stakeholders to improve safety for all roads. I'd also like to highlight specific policies within the IIJA that will enable and strengthen DOTs to actively and work specifically in improving safety infrastructure. The principles of the Safe Systems approach include acceptance of the shared responsibility for preventing serious crashes and roadway fatalities by proactively providing a transportation system that accounts for human mistakes, that reduces the impact of energy to the human body, and provides redundant protections for all road users to create a safe system. For example, in Louisiana, we've taken a proactive approach to reducing the potential for cross-median crashes on our high-speed divided highways that routinely result in deaths. We realize motorists can and will make mistakes which lead to roadway departure crashes when traveling at rates of speed. Due to the success of this innovation, we've deployed cable median barriers systematically to install them across the state. That's resulted in a 33% reduction in cross-median crashes. Very safely said, cable barriers save lives. States are identifying ways to incorporate equity into their safety analysis to better meet their individual roadway safety goals. In Louisiana, we've recently completed a statewide pedestrian crash assessment prior to IIJA. The risk factors identified included not just the average daily traffic or section length or population density, but we added the percentage of households with no vehicles, the percent of households below the poverty line, the percent of unemployed, and median household income and distance to school and work, and the types of shoulders that exist. We want to highlight that 35 states plus Puerto Rico have adopted complete street policies, as has Louisiana, where we've established a new engineering design position that provides expertise in the design of pedestrian and bike facilities. Louisiana uses complete streets approach to make improvements on non-motorized facilities on all roadway projects where practicable by working with our advisory council. Every state DOT in the nation in AASHTO stands with this committee and the administration and their unwavering support to do everything to make our roads safer. It's an honor to be with you this morning, and I look forward to an engaging discussion and answering your questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. I would now like to recognize Mr. Ludwig Gaines, Executive Director of the Washington Area Bicyclist Association. And Mr. Gaines, I'd like to thank you for your work in the District of Columbia and in the area surrounding this city. You may proceed for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Norton, Vice Chair DeFazio, and Ranking Member Davis for inviting me here today to speak to you about these important issues. I am Ludwig Gaines, Executive Director of WABA, Washington Area Bicycle Association, a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission at WABA is to empower people to ride bikes, build connections, and transform places. We envision a just, equitable, and sustainable transportation system where walking, biking, and transit are the best ways to get around. Throughout our 50-year history at WABA, and we are celebrating our 50th year this year, we have strived to be resolute in our pursuit of these aims. We do this through our educational offerings and programming for youth, adults, our advocacy, and through our outreach, engagement, and partnerships with diverse groups and communities throughout the region. Our geographic footprint is where many of you call home away from home. It is the District of Columbia, City of Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax County, in Virginia, Prince George's, and Montgomery counties in Maryland. My testimony today is informed by this rich history and must-do and can-do spirit at WABA to educate, advocate, and to elevate issues such as transportation safety critical to our membership and to our partners and supporters throughout the region. Our dedicated staff are daily on the front lines of the very issues we confront today. It is because of their work and our success that WABA is recognized as a force for bicycling and multimodal forms of transportation. My testimony also brings local transportation policy experience as a former elected Alexandria, Virginia City Council member and past leader of multiple local and regional bodies dealing with transportation issues. It's my goal through my testimony today, my written testimony submitted, to share a local and very sober assessment of the current state of affairs while offering guided and guarded optimism for the future. I have 5 key points to emphasize, and knowing that time is a premium, I'll walk through those areas first and perhaps get to them more in our Q&A. But we are headed in the wrong direction when it comes to transportation safety. Our roads are killing us, and it is completely avoidable. People walking and biking are the ones bearing the brunt of this danger. They are the ones most at disproportionate risk. There needs to be a reckoning about the inherent danger of driving and the impacts it has on our communities. Traffic safety is most definitely an equity issue. We know from the statistics that have been shared and will be shared that a disproportionate impact is visited upon poor, minority, and low-income communities, and that is a policy decision by decision makers not to resource those communities, and those communities are suffering. And lastly, that this is a solvable issue. I woke up this morning even more inspired to share my remarks today based on what soberingly we saw happening in our Washington, D.C. metro community. Young Caden Greene from Southeast Washington, D.C., who was struck and paralyzed on January 10th, passed away. He fought hard since January to survive. His family said every day he had a smile on his face despite his injuries. He succumbed because a driver, as he was walking home from school, fatally struck him in an intersection. I also woke up to the morning news that delivered the tragic news of 2 Oakton high school students who were killed by a driver just yesterday. Again, walking home from school, doing the natural. We must and have to find a better way to protect our communities, our children, and we have to begin with the acknowledgement that our streets are killing us. Literally, the statistics bear that out, but there are solutions through design, through outreach and engagement, and other opportunities that I look forward to sharing with you in my testimony today. We can solve this problem. We have many issues confronting us nationally, gun control being one, and the halls of Congress are filled with people advocating for solutions. The solutions are there. The recognition has to be that we have to prioritize people over cars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gaines. Our next witness is Mr. Hathaway, recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair and co-chairs and committee members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I also want to share that I'm on the policy committee for the Complete Streets Coalition and the Association for Pedestrians and Bicycle Professionals, so this just expands my interest. Arriving alive is more important than arriving a few minutes late, but for decades, the success of roadway design has been measured by one thing: increasing the flow of traffic. As drivers, we all know that speed kills. The way to save lives and reduce fatalities is to slow down. The same principle that applies to drivers applies to the engineers, such as me, that design our roads and those who set transportation policy. We need a greater focus on transportation safety. My message to you today is this: the guiding principle of transportation policy should be safety first, and the best way to assess the impact of that policy on human lives is an increased focus on two things: fatalities and serious injuries. I have lived and worked in Florida for 43 years as a transportation engineer. My passion for transportation safety resulted from the knowledge back in the mid-90s that about 42,000 people were dying on our roads every year when I was the state roadway design engineer at Florida Department of Transportation. The outcome of the pattern that we have created in the industry is higher speeds and more severe crashes. I was recruited back to DOT in 2011 by our secretary to lead the Southwest Florida District and champion Florida DOT's safety initiative to improve safety for pedestrians and bicyclists. This was a response to the Dangerous by Design report from Transportation for America. We had 4 of the top 5 most dangerous metropolitan areas in the country for pedestrians. Shortly after I returned, I began the shift at FDOT to an engineering education and enforcement focus on transportation safety, including the implementation of complete streets in 2014 in our design manuals. This was a move from a one-size-fits-all approach to street design to designing the right street for the right place. Nationally, our road system has been designed to minimize delay for motorists and maintain high speeds with less consideration of impacts to communities or quality of life for those who live within those communities. The cost of this approach for the last 60 years has been a preventable loss of about 115 people per day. When I became the Director of Transportation at the City of Orlando, I learned about the benefits of Vision Zero safe systems in eliminating fatalities and serious injuries. For agencies and countries that have taken this approach, they've successfully seen 18 to 80% reductions in fatalities and serious injuries. Consequently, we developed a Vision Zero action plan at the city, and we found out that our high injury network was responsible for 28 to 79% of the fatalities and serious injuries in each of our commissioner districts. The deaths of 61 people and over 2,700 serious injuries occurred during the 3 years of 2015 to 2017. This has become identified as a national public health crisis that is entirely preventable. The actions that can reverse this trend include state DOTs using the flexibility in the design manual to implement complete streets in their policy and design manuals with an increased focus on speed management to reduce fatalities and serious injuries. It requires that Vision Zero safe system principles be followed when federal funds are used for road design and operations. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today to this panel and look forward to your questions or concerns during that session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hadaway. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Cindy Williams, speaking on behalf of the American Traffic Safety Services Association. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Cindy Williams, and I'm president of Time Striping in Van Buren, Arkansas. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today about reducing roadway fatalities. Our company makes roads safer through the installation of pavement markings, guardrail and guard cable, and temporary traffic control devices in work zones. I'm testifying today in my role as a member of the Board of Directors for the American Traffic Safety Services Association. ATSA members manufacture, distribute, and install roadway safety infrastructure devices such as guardrail and cable barrier, traffic signs and signals, pavement markings, and work zone safety devices. Reaching zero fatalities remains a serious challenge. Just last month, it's mentioned before, NHTSA estimated that almost 43,000 people died on roadways across the country just last year. The Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act will play an important role in allowing states and local governments to make roadway safety investments. The IIJA provides nearly $30 billion over the next 5 years for roadway safety projects. I'd like to highlight just a few of these important programs. The Highway Safety Improvement Program is key to achieving 0 deaths and provides dedicated safety funds annually to each state and DC. The IIJA significantly increased funding for HSIP by providing nearly $16 billion. Having a dedicated funding stream for roadway safety has been critical, and continuing this program was a bipartisan priority for Congress and for ATSA. As we look to improve roadway safety, we cannot overlook rural America. Tragically, the fatality rate on rural roads is nearly 2 times greater than on urban roads. The IIJA includes a new Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program funded at $2 billion, 15% of which is reserved for addressing rural road fatalities due to lane departures. This program has the potential to dramatically improve roadway safety in rural areas across the country. Work zone safety is another passionate topic for me. In 1998, one of my company's crews was working on a highway in Mountain Home, Arkansas, removing the centerline stripe. An elderly gentleman who says he did not see any of the advance warning signs drove past our flagger, struck a worker on the elbow, and then drove straight into our other employee, killing him. That's an experience that to this day breaks my heart and recommits me and my company to our mission of 0 deaths. Technology is coming online today which will greatly enhance the safety of workers and drivers alike. Connected and automated vehicles will require adequate pavement markings, upgraded traffic signs and signals, as well as an ability to recognize work zones. Updating the transportation system with these kinds of improvements will both prepare us for the future while also addressing today's needs of safety. The IIJA also includes the Safe Streets and Roads for All program. This program provides $5 billion to local governments to help prevent roadway deaths and serious injuries. This program will address not just safety for the motorist, but for the other users of the transportation system, such as pedestrians, bicyclists, and motorcyclists, and will be an important tool for communities to address safety. The IIJA invests historic levels of funding in roadway safety, but challenges loom that will prevent the full implementation of the infrastructure package and put lives at risk. The construction industry is facing a significant workforce and material shortage. A recent survey of our member companies found that 92% are experiencing shortages of raw materials. Another challenge impacting the maximum effectiveness of the IIJA is the high rate of inflation. If these rates continue, our ability to reduce roadway fatalities and serious injuries will be undermined. As we look to address transportation safety, it's important to recognize that all of these issues are intertwined. To put it plainly, like we do in Arkansas, without fixing these issues, this country won't have the people or the materials that we need to save lives. The continued increase of traffic fatalities in the U.S. is incredibly tragic. As a safety professional, business owner, and a mother, the numbers are unacceptable, and I know we can do better. ATSA members are ready to do what we do best, roll up our sleeves and get to work. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you, Ms. Williams, for your testimony. I'd now like to recognize Chair DeFazio for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First to Mr. Wilson, you testified in your testimony that state DOTs are all in on safety for all users. Unfortunately, AASHTO also resists any attempts at, shall we say, dedicating directly money and impinging upon their flexibility. And I find it very disturbing that 21 states, despite this massive increase in fatalities, chose to transfer funding out of the Highway Safety Improvement Program in 2021. Can you tell me what the senior leadership and others at AASHTO are doing to perhaps put a little pressure on these states to stop transferring money out of the safety program, which could save lives while they're seeing an increase in fatalities?
Chairman DeFazio, thank you for the question. And I would assure you that in every mission and intent of every secretary that I've ever worked with, safety is paramount. That does create choices at the local level, which is why flexibility has been of value for states to use. And we trust that they will continue to make decisions. And with regards to redirecting funding, I would call your attention to mandates and directives and legislative authorities that states have to work with in terms of satisfying their governors, their legislature, and the publics in their various processes and what that flexibility allows. The core of your question, I believe, speaks to what AASHTO is doing to help focus and prioritize elements of safety and principles of how we operate. What we've done at AASHTO is continue to provide education. We continue to provide information and best practices on what's happening. I will be the first to tell you, not every state is going to do it equally. What we do in Louisiana is spend more on issues of safety than what we're required to do. We spend more on local roads than what we're required to do. But that's a commitment that Louisiana has made. And so AASHTO does not have that authority, unfortunately, to direct every state, and we appreciate Congress's effort and intentions on directing and placing dollars in priority where they do. I will assure you, though, that the dollars that are being spent are addressing comprehensive issues and safety, and I think what may be moved to another program, if it's safety dollars, it can still benefit in that other program from a safety purpose and a mission. So with respect to that, I would offer you that AASHTO remains committed, and we're happy to continue to have conversations on how we might be more aggressive in that space. We don't reject that opportunity or that role.
Well, congratulations on what your state is doing. Unfortunately, there are 21 other states that aren't putting more money into safety than they're being allocated. Does anybody else want to address that question on unmet needs for safety where money's being diverted on the panel? Anyone at all? Guess not. Okay.
Mr.
Yep.
Chairman, sorry,
Yes.
I was being able to pipe in here. I would like to address that if I can have a moment. I work in Idaho not only as a city council member, but also for a nonprofit that works around the state on safety issues. We've been active in an organization statewide, a coalition statewide that worked hard to advocate for our state DOT not to transfer those monies, and that effort was successful. So I would note that advocacy is incredibly important in this space, and the more that the advocates let the DOT know that transferring that safety money is not acceptable, the less likely it is that that will happen.
Excellent. Well, no, that's a good response, and that actually, when I recently addressed AASHTO, I said, you got what you wanted, which is extraordinary flexibility in the IIJA. You didn't have to do fix it first or any of the other things that were in the House bill. So it's now up to, you states individually, you leaders of the DOTs, and to citizen activists to make the case to their state legislatures and to their governors that this is unacceptable. As long as these numbers are going up, we should be spending as much as possible of the HSIP money on dedicated safety and also moving ahead more quickly with complete streets and other things. Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Chair DeFazio. I now recognize Mr. Crawford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In light of the topic of this hearing, I want to first offer my condolences to those who lost loved ones in the devastating collision that occurred just 2 days ago in my district involving a C.B. King Memorial School bus. This tragedy took the lives of 5 of my constituents and injured 5 others. My prayers are with those who are grieving, and I'm reminded of the urgency today to keep our roadways safe. Let me start my first question and direct this to Mr. Wilson. How are state and local governments taking into account the current supply chain challenges that we're facing now, the need to move freight efficiently as they consider design projects like the adoption of bike lanes? Narrowing vehicle travel lanes to accommodate bike lanes may be beneficial to cyclists, but how should state and local governments weigh that against the importance of moving critical goods like medicine, groceries, and baby formula?
Thank you, Congressman Crawford. I will tell you that states have robust planning efforts that engage not just a single stakeholder. So when we look at our state transportation plans that require freight plans where we identify those corridors that are focused specifically or intentionally on freight, we factor in safety in those implementations or those designs. And so we recognize the need to move freight on our systems. We all support a multimodal system in terms of infrastructure. And we also have to factor that into safety, whether it's the opening remarks around truck parking and not only the shortage and the safety, they also have remnants of deterioration on our system in terms of creating unsafe shoulders or drop-offs and things of that nature from where they park. So our statewide transportation plans, first and foremost, should address the long-term implications of how freight moves. With regard to the supply chain issues and what's happening with this, all the DOTs are monitoring those materials and the impacts on our projects. And so you can take something as simple as plastics and striping and other materials that are necessary for safety-type projects. The slowdown that we're seeing delays the ability to make a difference on those projects, whether they're roundabouts, signage, J-turns, you name it. The delays in either cables for cable barriers, all of those are factors that contribute to the ability of a state to implement projects that have already been proven, have been scientifically justified, and have advanced to the planning stage where we can no longer implement it immediately. And so that delay creates an opportunity for another death and another accident.
Gotcha. Let me shift gears real quick. I want to get your thoughts on this, Mr. Wilson, but also, Ms. Williams, I'd like to get your opinion as well. And Mr. Wilson, you mentioned in your testimony that rural roadway fatality rate is roughly twice the urban fatality rate. Can you expand a little more on how the Federal Highway Administration can work to make the guidance and technical support for the safe system approach meet the needs of rural areas like the district that I represent?
So, I think the context-sensitive approach to understanding what the cause is and looking at the countermeasures that are available and are applicable in those environments will require different type of elements. And so for us in Louisiana, you might see centerline rumble strips as opposed to just on the edge lines. You may see a wider striping or even a smaller striping depending on the capacity of the road and whether or not shoulders exist. And so states have that flexibility to be very context-focused to understand the problem and understand what's causing those accidents, and if they're correctable, we will apply them appropriately where the problem exists. So what happens in rural America doesn't necessarily suffice in urban America and vice versa, sure. And the data will speak for itself as well as the implementation tools that states have flexibility to apply.
Appreciate it. Ms. Williams, any thoughts?
I'm going to agree with the fact that rural America is totally different than the metropolitan areas. Arkansas is a very rural state. We are the natural state. Please accept my condolences as well. That was a hard article to read to see the accident that had occurred. It happened at an intersection. What are we doing to be safer in our efforts to sign intersections? Cross traffic does not stop. It was a major highway that van was crossing. So what are we doing to search out the location of these accidents, the causes of these accidents, and what can we do to collaborate and spend some of the HSIP money?
Let me ask you this. Mr. Wilson addressed the fact that the states have some flexibility in determining what works in urban areas, what doesn't work for rural areas, and so on. Does that go right down to the county level? So counties they know their roads really well. Do the counties have flexibility that they need to be able to implement some of these safety measures at their discretion so that, like this intersection that you mentioned where this fatality took place, would they have the flexibility to implement some safety countermeasures, measures?
Yes, they would. I know in Arkansas specifically, the counties have the opportunity to work with RDOT on some of the money that's there for, through the HSIP funds to go and look and see, what can we do?
So they've got the
These are
flexibility and the funding then?
They have to apply for the funding, yes.
Okay, great. I'm out of time, but thank you. I appreciate y'all being here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Gaines, the District of Columbia is a very walkable city, lots of parks, lots of bike riding, and of course, people ride on transit. Mr. Gaines, what are the most effective ways that we can improve roadway safety for all of these users using the same roads?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. And that is the compelling issue that we work at WABA every day. It is finding ways to accommodate all transportation participants in the infrastructure that exists. We have seen, after hard-fought battles, tremendous gains in the district and other areas in the DC metro region. One victory I would point out is bike lanes on Connecticut Avenue. That would have been unimaginable 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But what we're seeing is an accommodation and a recognition that pedestrians and bicyclists are as valuable as cars on our streets, our public roads, and in our transportation infrastructure. It is hugely a readjustment of our imagining our public spaces, one that doesn't favor the vehicle over people, but one that takes all of the participants into consideration fairly and equitably. We are seeing the increase that the rise in fatalities and crashes and injuries and the tragedies that have happened seemingly on a weekly, if not daily basis, directly because of the misprioritization of our traffic participants, transportation system participants. We have the opportunity through planning and zoning. I am a former city council member, former planning commissioner, to accommodate all of those users in the planning process. Hugely important process and one that has to respect all stakeholders. It is essential that as we do this planning, we are engaging in outreach and engagement with all communities. We've spoken about the equity issue, but for those who live in the District of Columbia, we know it was the deadliest year for traffic fatalities in the district's history. And we know that half of those fatalities came in Ward 7 and 8, predominantly African American. And we know that resourcing of remedies has to reach those communities. That's why at WABA, we're incredibly proud of our Zero Summit, which we hold every year with our stakeholders throughout the district to bring transportation solutions and experts to the communities themselves, our partnerships with those communities as well. We're equally proud this year. I came to WABA in January, and we have secured a DDOT grant to work in conjunction with Howard University and their engineering department, specifically in Ward 7 and Ward 8, to create crash trackers for youth. We're seeing that an inordinate amount of youth are suffering accidents coming and going from school. We see that the infrastructure in these communities is not one that favors traffic safety. It's actually one that leads to traffic injuries, crashes, and fatalities. So part of our goal is to reach out to the communities directly themselves, to go to the source where the problems are, and to provide important data to our decision makers about tracking crashes and vulnerable intersections and high impact intersections. I'll leave you with this. We on this issue, we have seen repeatedly that these accidents are happening at the same intersections, the same streets, the same roads consistently. Just last week, A young 18-year-old in Bethesda was struck and killed while riding his bicycle. 2 years prior, another 17-year-old struck and killed at the same intersection. The advocates on the ground, and these are the ones that we must listen to. Advocates on the ground are the ones who have been fighting and lobbying for this to little avail. And until we correct the mindset amongst our decision makers and those who are allocating these scarce resources and prioritizing our roads, we're going to continue to see it. And it really requires us to reorient our philosophy and approach to what safe streets are. And safe streets must begin by putting people first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I now call on Mr. Babin. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it very much. Thank you all for being here today and for taking the time to testify before our committee. And without doubt, the statistics we've gone over today are very concerning, and the need to make our roads safer is very apparent. Ms. Williams, Cindy Williams, if I'd like to ask you a question, this one here. First off, you're very lucky to be represented by such a fine lawmaker in Bruce Westerman from Arkansas, from that Arkansas district. He and I were classmates. We came in together the same year, and we've worked alongside each other, not only on this subcommittee, on TNI, but others as well, his own. I deeply appreciate his leadership and friendship. As you noted in your testimony, a historic level of funding was injected into the transportation and infrastructure sector with the passage of the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, or IIJA. However, we all know that simply throwing money at problems doesn't actually solve those problems. Throwing taxpayer dollars at the infrastructure industry without solving the supply chain crisis, the pandemic recovery issues like fraud and abuse, major workforce shortages, overly burdensome bureaucratic red tape, and other underlying issues will not actually allow us to see long-term sustainable improvement and investment in our nation's infrastructure, and that includes improvements in our road safety. Unfortunately, however, throwing billions of taxpayer dollars in an effort to solve issues seems to be a very prevalent state up here, the status quo, if you will. In fact, as all of my colleagues here should recall, last year, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan into law, sending out billions and billions of additional American taxpayer dollars under the guise of COVID relief and economic stimulus with a big government top-down spending approach. And now, billions of those dollars are still allocated by the American Rescue Plan, are still unspent many months later. Bureaucrats here in Washington have made rules to hold up funds that could and should be utilized by state and local governments to improve our infrastructure ourselves. Instead of fixing the roads and installing stoplights, building bridges, and filling up potholes, these funds are stuck in coffers our state and local officials cannot even use. All of the while, Congress continues to authorize and appropriate more and more new money. I co-sponsored the State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Fiscal Recovery, Infrastructure, and Disaster Relief Flexibility Act, which was introduced by my friend Dusty Johnson, who also serves on this subcommittee, which would have given states and localities freedom to utilize certain unspent COVID relief dollars on infrastructure projects. Imagine that, spending what we've already appropriated instead of passing billions in new funds. Without a doubt, this reckless spending has played a serious part in the current inflation and economic uncertainty that we're all seeing today and feeling of very acutely in our own wallets. In your testimony, you touched on the harm that inflation is having on your industry, and I thank you for bravely standing up and mentioning this important topic. So would you please elaborate on how inflation, especially the historic record-setting high inflation that we're seeing today, the highest in 41 years, impacts your industry and thus the safety of Americans traveling on our roads and our highways?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think just look at it from the very bare bones basic of inflation is causing our raw materials to be more expensive, which makes it more expensive for me to purchase those materials, which makes my bid much more expensive to my contractors, who then bid that to RDOT. Then we turn around, we've got inflated fuel prices. We're looking at wage rates increasing if we can find the workers. You mentioned that as well. So when we go and place a bid for a job, it is a much more expensive bid than it has been in the past. Bottom line, what that turns into is less money for less projects for safety.
Right. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Garcia.
What?
You went over to see him? Garcia.
Mr. Garcia. I now call on Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Chair Norton and DeFazio, for holding this very important hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Unfortunately, the title of this hearing, Addressing the Roadway Safety Crisis, is true. We are facing a safety crisis on our roads. A few weeks ago, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration released the road safety data for 2021. The data is horrifying. Almost 43,000 people died in traffic crashes and thousands more were injured. This is the worst number in 16 years. We're going backward instead of making progress. Oftentimes, we use the word accident to refer to traffic crashes where people get killed or injured. The term accident suggests that there was nothing we could do to stop these crashes, that no one was at fault. It was just an accident. But in fact, the complete opposite is true. As policymakers and transportation professionals, we have all the tools we need to reduce and eliminate traffic crashes and save thousands of lives each year. Regrettably, we choose not to use them. We continue to prioritize the speed of vehicles over the safety of road users, even though speeding is one of the top 2 causes of traffic crashes. We don't require cars to be designed to reduce the impact of traffic crashes on pedestrians and cyclists. And we don't build safe infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists like sidewalks and protected bike lanes, even though we know how to do so. I want to end by recognizing the advocates and organizations like Families for Safe Streets and the Institute for Safer Trucking, and advocates for highway and auto safety that fight every day to save lives. Too often, they themselves have had family members killed in traffic crashes, and they carry that pain every day. The current situation is grim, but I hope that we can collectively work together to make progress. Lives are at stake. A question for Elaine Clegg, Council President from Boise. In your testimony, you discuss how the manual on uniform traffic control devices, known as MUTCD, needs to be modernized. For those not familiar with MUTCD, it's the guidebook that traffic engineers use when installing traffic control devices and street markings on our streets. It has not been updated since 2009, and it is outdated, especially in keeping pedestrians and cyclists safe. In the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Congress directed USDOT to revise the MUTCD, including by making sure that vulnerable users like pedestrians and cyclists are protected. You state in your testimony that local governments have found that MUTCD in its current form and governance is a roadblock to safety improvements and innovation. From the National League of Cities perspective, what reforms need to be made to MUTCD to modernize it and ensure that we're doing everything to make our roads safer?
Madam Chair, Representative Garcia, thank you for the question. Really appreciate it. And you are correct that clearly the MUTCD is not working to create safer conditions as we're seeing this crisis grow. In Idaho, crashes increased 36% last year, three times the national average. I'm very concerned about this growing crisis. MUTCD is arcane. It needs to be. There's a lot of detail in it about how to do striping, how to do signage, how to do roadway markings, but it's become quite confusing. It's difficult, especially for small jurisdictions to use. They have to hire expensive traffic engineers to interpret for them what's appropriate. We often find that we ask for something and MUTCD is used as a reason not to do that because there's some arcane rule somewhere that says that's not the appropriate measure. We need it to be clear, concise, and usable by all users. We also need it to really focus on what it was intended to do and be unburdened by all of the other things it's been asked to do over the years. If we had one ask of MUTCD, it would be to listen to those comments that were turned in last year when the comment period was open from experts all over the country about how to make it more clear, more concise, and easier to use for especially local jurisdictions across the country. We don't have the same number and kind of traffic engineers that the state DOTs do, and we need that help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My time has run out, so I will submit additional questions in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. I now recognize my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Williams, the safety needs of rural communities that I represent are often different than the safety needs of major metropolitan areas. How important is it that we ensure our local communities and states have the ability to address their specific needs as opposed to a one-size-fits-all federal approach to safety?
I think it's incredibly important, and that's where we just all need to work together, making sure that we're meeting the needs of both.
Well, and I appreciate that. And I've long advocated for the creation of a marijuana impairment detection system. Unfortunately, there are some roadblocks at the federal level into researching marijuana impairment, which is why I helped author language that was included in IJA, calling on DOT to study what roadblocks exist and how to move past them. As more and more states, like my home state of Illinois, legalize recreational marijuana use, how important is it that law enforcement has the necessary tools to keep our streets safe from drugged drivers?
I think it's incredibly important, and looking at a system that would check their impairment at the time would be great. I think we also need to look at it from a different perspective as well. I try to hire employees who can't pass a drug test because they may have done something over the weekend. Well, now they may not be high right now, but they can't get a job because I'm regulated by the Department of Transportation. My gentlemen drive big trucks. We are required by DOT that they have to have a clean driving record, or a clean drug test. So I think we need to look at it from that perspective as well.
Yeah, we do. I mean, look, you have legal products like alcohol, you have a measurement.
Yes.
If somebody is impaired, then they can't drive. If somebody is impaired in driving that, then they should lose their privileges if they test higher than what the legal limit is. So I'd love to work with you and the association to move these research projects forward. Mr. Wilson, it seems that data is paramount when determining where and how to spend our safety dollars. How does data inform decisions and investments related to highway infrastructure?
Sorry about that, Congressman. Very good question. Data is absolutely essential for us to make the most informed and strategic safety decisions as to where we apply solutions that have been proven to work. With IIJA and their investment in the ability for us to collect that, Louisiana and other states are doing a great deal of work in working with locals to understand what's happening to vulnerable road users, non-motorized users on the local system as well as the state system, and making that data more accessible to be able to be used and applied to projects is absolutely essential, whether it's with tribal communities and territories or local governments. To have the transparency of information to make the most informed decisions is paramount to saving lives and protecting people. No different than what Mr. Gaines shared in terms of looking at intersections and where you see historic repeat accidents. The data should drive the actions of a state as it relates to making safety decisions.
Well, data's long been used to make decisions when it comes to highway improvements. I mean, we have traffic studies in my home state of Illinois. When we're begging for roadway improvements, they'll do the studies, they'll use that data. As you see, more and more federal tax dollars invested in data collection. My concern is, and I would like to know from you, where is that data that can be used by our local DOT in the state of Illinois or elsewhere in the country or local governments? Where is that sourced from?
So the data, where it's sourced from, it's sourced from those communities. It's sourced from the accident reports. It's sourced from vehicle data that we see. And so it shows up in our regular highway priority program. So when we actually roll out a capital program, as I know Secretary of Illinois, when they roll out their program, they've spent the time to look at data to make a constrained decision based on the resources that are available and focus the focus the resources where the accidents are and or make the improvements that the data says it's going to have the biggest impact as opposed to not.
So that's not real-time data. That's kind of more data research.
Well, I think it's data research, but there's an evolving element of data collection. So from a traffic standpoint, we use these cell phones now to tell us where people are. You can triangulate that with existing data that we've collected historically on our system and be very predictive. We're looking at predictive analysis on where we will see accidents so we can best position from a traffic management standpoint, vehicles to be able to remove them, but also to be able to use education and to notify people ahead of them approaching a situation where there's a potential for rear ends or side swipes, whatever it may be.
I'd love to work with you and all the witnesses as we move forward into more of a real-time data collectability atmosphere here within traffic safety. So look forward to working with you. Thanks for answering my questions. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I now recognize Mr. Johnson of Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your time and testimony. Current estimates are that nearly 43,000 people died in motor vehicle traffic crashes last year, a 10.5% increase from 2020. This is more than just cars crashing into one another. Pedestrian fatalities are also on the rise. Bicycle fatalities are on the rise, and also motorcyclist fatalities are on the rise. These increases reflect not just the inherent risks of driving, but the very design of our roadways. Federal regulations and improvements in vehicle design have made it safer to be inside of a vehicle. Now we must apply the same commitment to safety for people outside of vehicles. Safe roadway and community design is an essential part of reducing these rising deaths, and designing streets for safety must be a priority. While pedestrian safety impacts all Americans, the risks are not evenly distributed. According to a recent Governor's Highway Safety Association study, Black children ages 4 to 15 had the highest rates of fatalities involving pedestrians as a percentage of all motor vehicle traffic fatalities. Dr. Wilson, are you familiar with these statistics? And if so, how do you explain them?
Congressman Johnson, I am familiar with those statistics. It is not much different than what we're seeing in Louisiana in terms of where our crashes and fatalities are occurring. I think the difference or the reason why we're paying more attention to it is because of the focus that this administration and IIJA have placed on looking at equity in terms of how it impacts humans and lives. And so, as I mentioned to you with our highway safety program and in previous testimony here today, I've indicated ways in which we're looking at communities and are assessing data based on demographics, where we can now look at what's happening in a community that has historic poverty levels or has historic access, and we see the gaps in our system as it relates to sidewalks or lighting or other elements that will make it safer for those citizens. So it is in fact alarming, and I think we owe it to communities to equitably distribute our safety dollars, to equitably distribute our capacity dollars and everything else so that we have a comprehensive system. And so where we can invest in pedestrians and bicyclists in places where we have not, we absolutely should. And unfortunately, the data is pointing us in the direction of those communities of color or communities of consistent poverty where we're having the greatest impact on losing lives, and that just perpetuates their problem from a financial perspective and the impact on those families.
Thank you. Tell me what can be done to change road design from prioritizing speed to safety.
I will tell you from a national perspective, engaging in active conversations with stakeholders is absolutely essential. The updates to the MUTCD are absolutely essential. And then empowering engineers to be able to make decisions at the state level and at the local level that will allow for engineering judgment to apply itself appropriately. We've had several situations in Louisiana where there have been requests for speed and reductions, and we do data and we look at the assessments. But that's only a part of the equation. We also have to look at land use. You have to look at what access management authorities exist, and that oftentimes will be given to the local governments as opposed to a state government. And so that has to be a collaborative conversation, one in which we look at the data collectively, and then that we understand our responsibilities. And that's the value of a safe systems approach, is it's going to share responsibility for ensuring people are safe, and such that it's not just about speed, it's about enforcement, it's about design, it's about education, it's about awareness, it's about land use decisions, and that is something that is universal across the country when it relates to infrastructure.
All right, thank you. Ms. Clegg, when you described in your testimony the death of a woman at an unmarked intersection, it struck a chord. In my home state of Georgia, 182 pedestrians died in the first 6 months of 2021, a 77% increase from the same period in the previous year. And in Atlanta, there were 29 pedestrian deaths in 2021, nearly double the number in 2020. In your experience, how can we prevent such fatalities? And also, has the unmarked intersection you described been properly marked since the woman you mentioned lost her life?
Madam Chair, Representative Johnson, thank you for the question. No, it has not been fixed, and it still haunts me. And I guess I'll respond by talking a little bit about Mr. Wilson's testimony that DOTs do need to work with locals to look at context and make changes appropriate based on that context. In the case that you're talking about, the city of Boise has a highway that runs along the edge of our downtown. It's a 5-lane facility in both directions, 2 different roadways. We worked with the state DOT over a period of a year to examine the safety issues on it and try to come up with solutions for how to make it safer. From the city's perspective, those solutions included reducing the number of lanes, reducing lane widths, and increasing the number of marked crossings. The state DOT was unwilling to make many of the improvements that we suggested based on their perception that it was more important to continue moving traffic more speedily along that corridor. I think this brings up a really important issue that you can move traffic at a lower speed during the time it's moving and still have it travel through a corridor in the same amount of time if you design that corridor correctly with good traffic signal timing. We often look at the travel speed during the time we're traveling as the only measure rather than the entire picture of what's happening along the corridor. I will continue to work to increase the crossings on that corridor, as well as others in our region that have similar issues. Thank you again for your question.
Thank you.
Gentleman's
And I
time
yield
has
back.
expired. I now recognize Mr. Boss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, Mr. Wilson, as you know, the national shortage of parking is a safety crisis. There's been dozens of studies, including surveys by numerous states and 2 from the U.S. DOT, that have confirmed there simply isn't enough parking for the number of trucks on the road. U.S. DOT's most recent report on the issue found that the shortage is a problem in every state and every region. Even the most recent report, the administration failed to mention truck parking not even once in their national road safety strategy. If a trucker can't find a safe and legal parking spot, they often resort to parking in areas like highway shoulders, entrances and exit ramps. Parking in these locations create a hazard for the personal safety of the driver, but also for other motorists. But if a trucker is fatigued or running out of their hours of service, they have no other choice than to try to find some place to pull those trucks off. Now, right now, the states could be working to fix this issue with federal money, but unfortunately, DOT's own data shows that few, if any, states are creating new parking spaces, and some are even losing those parking spaces. So the question for ATO perspective is, given this clear need for parking, the obvious safety implementations, and can you talk about why we haven't seen any real truck parking capacity expansions from the states? And since US DOT and many other states and many states have identified the parking shortage as a safety hazard, can you discuss what states are doing to try to make progress on this issue?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. And I would echo the concerns about truck parking. Louisiana and the I-10 corridor is absolutely critical to freight transportation, and it's a multimodal corridor for our country. I will tell you from a Louisiana perspective, one of the challenges with a state DOT making the investment in truck parking is the potential competition with the commercial side of what we provide for trucking. I can point to several truck stops along I-10 that have expanded the capacity to the point that they're doubling their sizes of that footprint, with many more services that are available for the trucker, for that trucking community, than what a state would be in a position to provide. That's one aspect. The second aspect of it has to do with this NIMBY approach, that we see a tremendous amount of growth and development in residential communities all along our interstate, and where they have those opportunities to safely maneuver and interchange, you run into a neighborhood immediately, and there's a lot of local resistance to where we have the potential for capacity. Another issue in Louisiana is I do not have the authority to expropriate for parking. I can expropriate for a highway, and so even if we wanted to be extremely aggressive in this area, and we have a commercial trucking position in my department to help work and coordinate with that community, we would not be in a position to exercise the full authority that we have to be able to make the types of impacts from a safety perspective. And so we resort to education, we resort to providing information, and working with our trucking community, whether it's commercial and or our local trucking community, to try and support the trucking demand. And I would advocate and support the idea of having discretionary dollars available for the purposes of doing that, but I think that needs to work with helping the infrastructure expand and not necessarily labor it to a department to be responsible for the entire parking support services that are necessary.
Would you be able to get your members to put together some data for us? This is an issue that I've been trying to work on. I came from the trucking industry. I watched this going on. I've also known that early on, when we saw a lot of the states actually closing rest areas, and that was because of the crime rate and everything in that in those areas. But if you could get the data to us, so we can.
We would be happy to do that, and we're a state that was in a position of reducing the number of rest areas, not because of crime, but because of development and the need to not compete with a quarter of a mile down the road interchange that has been placed and is now servicing trucks and commercial services on all four quadrants of that interchange. And so it converges with development, and I think it goes back to this land use conversation in terms of what communities are doing. But we would be happy at AASHTO to share with you some of the challenges that states see and potential solutions that would help deliver more parking sooner rather than later.
I appreciate that. Thank you for answering the questions, being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Bosch. Mr. Stanton, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership in ensuring that this committee and this Congress is focused in on saving more American lives on our roadways. The alarming increase in traffic fatalities over the last 2 years is a wake-up call for all of us. And as much as it is important to highlight the challenges we face throughout our nation, the reality is that the problem is much worse in Indian country. Traffic accidents are the leading cause of death for American Indians. They are twice as likely to be killed in a traffic crash than the rest of our country's population. For Native children, the statistics are even more alarming. Traffic fatality rates are 2 to 5 times higher for those under the age of 19 than other racial and ethnic groups. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration reports that American Indians are especially at risk for fatal car crashes in the Four Corner regions in the Southwest. That's a rural area, but from 2013 to 2019, there were 583 traffic fatalities there. That is truly shocking. More than 3/4 of the fatalities were Native Americans. Nearly 1 in 5 were a pedestrian or a bicyclist. As we work to improve roadways throughout our country, we cannot forget our tribal communities. With historic investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we are beginning to reverse decades of underinvestment in our tribal communities. Just yesterday, the Department of Transportation awarded nearly $9 million to 51 tribes to improve roadway safety, including nearly $1 million grant for the Navajo Nation. That's a good start, but much work lies ahead to truly make our roadways safer in tribal communities. Ms. Clegg, based on your work with tribal nations in Idaho, what can we do to focus more attention and resources on tribal roadway safety?
Thank you, Representative. I appreciate the question. I've worked with a number of tribes in the state of Idaho, and the city of Boise has instituted a program called the Return of the Boise Valley People, where we meet once a year with all of the 5 tribes that used to populate our region. I think that's the key, coordination. When I've worked with the tribal communities in other parts of the state, what I've found is that there are county governments, the tribal government, the state DOT, and often a city government, all with competing interests and competing ideas about how to improve safety. I've not seen great coordination in those conversations, although it's getting better. I think the need that, for instance, in the city of Lapway, I worked on a project for Safe Routes to School. There was a proposal to build a housing development across the highway, which would require children crossing the highway to get to school. I recommended that they not build housing on that side of the highway if they could avoid it. They ended up not doing that. So having the technical assistance to help them figure out what is the right solution, but also having the city, the county, the state DOT, and the tribe working together in that particular situation to come up with a coordinated answer and a coordinated strategy really made a difference. So if I had a suggestion, it would be require that kind of cooperation on a regular basis and make sure that it leads to a coordinated solution and not a top-down one.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson or Mrs. Williams. Maybe same question. What can we do to focus more attention and resources on tribal roadway safety?
Congressman, great question. I think this speaks directly to the ranking member's question around data and the transparency of what's available. State DOTs provide local technical assistance, and we work with federal highways to coordinate for those local road assistance programs and highway safety initiatives that will benefit roads adjacent to or near tribal lands. I have experience in Louisiana working with Coshada and other tribes to make improvements and making the best possible decisions for crossing signals, as well as access to other governmental services. But I think it's going to begin with having a real transparent, coordinated conversation to provide meaningful solutions that we don't necessarily just direct. And I think it's important for us also to be sensitive to the cultural uniquenesses of what happens in tribal communities, such that we can be respectful and actually get some things done to reduce those numbers.
I've run out of time, so Ms. Williams, maybe you can answer the question maybe in writing after the hearing. Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Mr. Nels for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and I would like to thank the witnesses for testifying here today, and I'll be brief. I mean, we've said it several times now, 43,000 people were killed on U.S. roads last year, the highest number in 16 years. It's a 10.5% jump over 2020 numbers, and hopefully is an outlier rather than a new trend. And while I'm thankful for all the expert and witness testimony, I think it's incredibly unfortunate and irresponsible that we do not have somebody from the administration here. Why isn't Administrator Cliff sitting before us? After all, Administrator Cliff oversees the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, the nation's vehicle safety agency. And it's a shame. It's a missed opportunity for this committee to conduct oversight and hold this administration accountable. Ms. Williams, I'd like to ask you about rural safety. I read in your testimony that 19% of Americans live in the rural areas, yet 43% of all roadway fatalities occur on rural roads. You mentioned that a lot of rural roads are owned by local governments who may not have the technical expertise or resources to combat safety challenges. So is there anything this committee or Congress can do to alleviate this issue?
Collaborate, completely and totally collaborate. The states need to be working with the local governments, working with you all, and I hope that you all will continue to work together on legislation that would assist them with such.
You know, I was in law enforcement for 30 years. I was a sheriff for 8 years, quite a large county, 850,000 people, almost 1,000 square miles. And, you know, when our agency would be notified, we would see areas that we were seeing an increase in crashes, whether it was an intersection, a road junction. We would send officers, traffic officers, to try to address that issue, try to manage that issue, try to mitigate, try to do everything we could to reduce the number of car crashes and or fatalities. And unfortunately, what I've noticed is that many law enforcement officers are leaving the profession. They're just not there to try to help us reduce this. So a question for the panel, simple yes or no. Do you feel that the defund the police movement and anti-police rhetoric we have seen has contributed to the increase in fatalities on our roads? Mr. Wilson.
Congressman,
a simple yes or no.
No.
I've got the other
No.
questions.
No.
No, sir.
No.
Well, I would actually, this is what I expected, but I would beg to differ. I would beg to differ because what I noticed is that when we had law enforcement out there protecting our nation's road, helping to address the violators, the speeding vehicles and everything, when we sent officers out there, it was addressed and we've seen a significant reduction. So it doesn't surprise me with your answers. I yield back.
Congressman, if I could just respond quickly. I respect the question and respect our law enforcement officers, but what we found is having law enforcement officers who are best prepared and trained to deal with traffic incidents is the most important aspect of the reporting and data collection. What we found at WABA in 2017, that nearly 1/3 of all pedestrian bicycle accidents went unreported. That doesn't even capture near misses on our roads and streets. So what we did was work with, and I'm sorry Mr. Nels left, but what we did was work with local law enforcement to correct the data collection on site as the incident occurred, and the product has been better reporting. So there is an absolute collaboration, as Ms. Williams stated, and one where there can be productive outcomes in collaboration with law enforcement and community members. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for that answer. I now recognize Mr. Lamb for 5 minutes. In the absence of Mr. Lamb at the moment, I recognize Mr. Auchincloss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for convening this hearing. As a former city councilor, I chaired the Transportation and Public Safety Committee and was a member of the Land Use Committee in my hometown. I became closely familiar with the implementation challenges associated with walkability and microtransit and safe streets. Throughout this work, both at the local level and at the federal level, I've incorporated an approach from the bottoms-up movement called Strong Towns, originated in Minnesota by a recovering roadway engineer and has now really gone nationwide and inspired citizens and developers and transportation planners to think differently about how we design and develop our city streets. It seeks to replace America's post-war pattern of development, a very brittle one focused on automobile traffic and single-family zoning, with a much more vital and socioeconomically rich pattern of multifamily development and streets oriented around people. And this is especially salient and urgent now because as fatalities of people walking and biking on our roads continues to rise, it's just very clear that our pattern of roadway design and the status quo isn't working. Following the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure package, I've been proud to support a new agency authorized in that bill, the Advanced Research Projects Agency Infrastructure, ARPA-I, which can be an incubator for innovation to support the Strong Towns approach to roadway design. And I'm hopeful that the witnesses today, as you have already, can help us brainstorm for how to incorporate Strong Towns in our planning and development. On that vein, my first question is for Councilor Clegg. Thank you for your helpful commentary so far. The Strong Towns approach operates with the understanding that it's not enough to merely accommodate pedestrians on roads that are dominated by automobiles, but rather to flip that dynamic and to accommodate automobiles on roads that are dominated by pedestrians. Our streetways need to be places that are at human scale and that feel and are indeed safe for humans. Can you talk to us about how you are trying to reprioritize how we think about street design in the Strong Towns approach, how we are trying to, or you might be trying to, instead of attribute fatalities to driver error, which research has shown is not the biggest cause of fatalities, rather to recognize that roadway design is really the culprit here, and we must think differently about how we design roads from first principles.
Thank you, Representative. I would absolutely love to answer that question. In fact, we've had Chuck Marone come to Boise and talk to us about the Strong Towns approach. And
I've had him come to my district too. That's fantastic.
Yes, and so I would go to a story about a small town in Idaho. Most of my day work is in very small rural communities, a place where the public works director is also the baseball coach and the EMT. And we were looking at the roadways there and trying to figure out how to make them safer and more inviting for pedestrians. We decided on some roadway markings. He was excited to try it. And when we showed up 3 weeks later to do it, he had his baseball striping machine to stripe the road because it's such a small town. He had no other way to do it, but it worked. So I think the lesson is that we need to allow people to innovate. We need to allow people to respond to local conditions. It's interesting to me that roadways that were built long before we had traffic engineers and an AASHTO Green Belt book are the ones that are the safest.
That's right.
Everywhere in the country. And it's because the roadways are narrower for cars and wider for pedestrians. There's a tree lawn, there's a separated sidewalk where there are bike facilities. They're very safe. And so as we look to flip this, I think we have plenty of space that we've set aside for right-of-way. We've just used it, I believe, in the wrong way. We need to think again about how to reuse that space and prioritize shared streets for all people. We all can envision that picture that we've seen of the historic downtown street with a street horse and a car and a person on foot and maybe one of those three-wheeled bicycles. And they all were able to share that space because the street was designed in a way that sharing it was safe. We
Counselor,
can get back.
I have to interject, but I appreciate your answer. Couldn't have said it better myself. And I would just add on to that, that part of that repurposing of shared space is going to need to be parking. We have subsidized parking in this country, especially in our densely settled areas, to an egregious degree. And we're going to have to repurpose and think differently about storage for vehicles and think instead about creating shared spaces for humans. Chairwoman, I'd like to submit for the record the Strong Towns strategy, which they just came out with recently.
So ordered.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Ms. Van Dyne for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Texas is one of just 7 states, which in total account for 54% of pedestrian fatalities nationwide. Fatality rates that are consistently above the national average are the reason behind the Federal Highway Administration designating Texas as a pedestrian-focused state. Nationally, we saw a 21% increase in 2021 over 2020 in traffic fatalities. There's no doubt that this is a growing problem as we continue to see fatalities on the rise, but my concern is we continue to see this problem and this program as a slush fund for non-safety related projects and often see money as the only solution. Additionally, I'm very concerned that many of the Vision Zero plans put a focus on enforcement, and yet this is a waste of time if district attorneys are not serious about prosecuting criminals and keeping them off of our streets. 22% of pedestrian crashes in North Texas were hit and runs. Enforcement is huge, but so is prosecution. In Los Angeles, we all saw that video over and over again of a teenager who was on probation at the time. He pled guilty to intentionally driving a stolen car into a mother who was walking her child with a stroller. The LA County District Attorney declined to charge the driver with assault with a deadly weapon or attempted murder. Ms. Clegg, as a former mayor myself, I have utmost respect for local elected officials, and I understand that we need to get buy-in across the board. But how can elected officials, we have the support of law enforcement on this, but how can elected officials assume that we also have the buy-in of prosecutors, that they are prosecuting criminals and that they are ensuring that the laws continue to act as a deterrent and are just not ignored?
Thank you, Representative. Well, I can tell you in Idaho, our prosecutors do support us, and I am really pleased about that. I'll also say this, enforcement is the last resort, and it happens because our road design is such that the only way to slow people down is enforcement. What we really need to do, in my opinion, certainly my measured opinion based on many years of working with small communities around the state, is look at the roadway design and make it such that the design—
Well, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that we could talk about roadway design, but again, as an elected official, as a local, former council member and a former mayor, I know that when we would talk about expanding our roadways, the first typical thing that we were going to lose is housing. And, in North Texas, I don't know what it's like in Boise, but in North Texas, we already have a huge shortage of homes in need. So in order to expand these roadways, we're actually going to have to lose single family homes. So how can we do both, making sure that we're responsive, but also not losing single family homes in the process?
Thank you. I believe that we should not be expanding roads. We should be building better connected networks and allowing people choices in transportation so that the roads don't get so congested that we try to expand them and lose housing. In our region.
But when you have communities that are growing like mine, or double-digit percentages nearly every month, you don't have enough options now. And we are building, whether or not it's our rapid transit, whether or not it's bus systems, whether or not it's trains, we don't have enough now. So how can you meet the needs of the population that you have now without continuing to just throw more money at it?
We can meet the needs by continuing to offer more choices. You know, expanding the roadways, if it worked, we wouldn't have 23-lane freeways that were always congested. It doesn't really work. What does work is connected systems, a network of which people have many choices in how to get around. And if we can do that, I believe we can solve this problem.
I appreciate that. I would also like to follow up on the many safety programs that were included in the IIJA because there was a large number of grants. In recent years, we have seen many cities across the country implement Vision Zero plans, which are often well-funded and well-intended, and yet we continue to see, after all of these years of implementation, record increases in fatalities. So why do you think these programs are not working?
Thank you again. I believe that they aren't working because we haven't changed what we're doing. If the definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again and assuming we'll get a different answer, we haven't gotten a different answer. We need to change what we're doing. We need to.
So we're basically just putting good money after bad. All right, I appreciate that. My time has expired. Thank you.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Mr. Moulton, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to start by just continuing with my colleague from Texas's line of questioning. I mean, this is a question that folk faces a lot of American cities. Boston actually has the worst traffic in the country by many measures. And there are people who are calling for simply building more lanes on highways, even though, I mean, transportation philosophy theories have told us for decades that if you add lanes to highways, you just make traffic worse. And it especially makes it worse in our cities because, of course, it just puts more cars into downtown. So even if you can get a little bit more quickly between rural areas or suburban areas, it's going to make traffic, once you get into congested areas, even worse. You know, what a contrast traveling to almost every other country in the world where you have good options. In transit, trains, regional rail, high-speed rail, these are not considered second choice, second class options to getting in your family car and driving, because they can actually get you more quickly to where you need to go than by driving. And that's what encourages people to use them, right? We don't want people to take trains because the roads are so congested they have to take a second class option. We want people to take trains because they're faster and more efficient. And oh, by the way, also a lot safer than driving. That's what we should be aiming for. And yet that just doesn't seem to be an option. Ms. Clegg, could you just talk about why that's the case here in America, why we don't have a much more balanced transportation system?
Thank you, Representative. Great question. If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be pretty rich because a lot of people have been trying to answer that question for a long time. For me, it's because we have allowed our federal system to flow through a system that was originally designed for freeways, and rather than reimagine that system and reimagine how it could be designed for trains or regional rail or bus rapid transit, we've just continued to pump more money into the existing system. I think now is our opportunity to reimagine what that means. The flexibility in IIJ is a wonderful start, but it doesn't require that that reimagination happen. I think we can use it, however, through advocacy and through using the money well to begin to show the success of trying these other options, showing how they actually do work, looking at the reduction, I believe, that we'll see in fatalities and serious injuries, And through that, over time, really do change the system that we have now from one that's focused primarily on state departments of transportation and highways to one that's focused on transportation writ large for all people.
I mean, isn't the essence of freedom having choice, right? Not being forced to take a car everywhere you want to go. I mean, people in Asia, people in Europe, they have choice. We don't have choice in most of America when it comes to transportation. I'm also struck by Ms. Van Dyne's point about taking single family homes to expand highways. You know, one double track rail line has the capacity of about 10 to 12 highway lanes. So Representative Van Dyne, that's your answer. Don't add one more lane, which will only make traffic worse. We've seen that by experience. Spend any time in Texas, you can prove it. What we should be doing is giving better options, and not some slow 1950s diesel powered commuter train that only goes 50 miles an hour, but trains that are modern like our highways are and compete with the rest of the world. I also noticed that traffic deaths are far lower in Europe. Europe has implemented a lot of safe streets and other policies like that. Mr. Hadaway and Dr. Wilson, what prompted the Complete Streets program in your programs in your respective states, and how successful have those programs been? Are they a model for the rest of the country?
Thank you, Representative. There we go. Sorry about that. Our program was put into place in 2014, and all of our design manuals were updated in 2018. So the actual projects that have been built on the state road system while I was there are still in process, but there have been significant changes in the approach that DOT is taking, both in terms of working with local governments, but again, allowing the flexibility that we have in design to design for pedestrians and bicyclists and still maintain the operating capacity of the roadway. The other thing that DOT is doing is focusing on working with local agencies to improve land development patterns and increase the network of streets at the local level, which will help take some of the travel demand off the state and federal system.
Well, my time has expired, but I appreciate that very much. It's striking that out of the 37 countries measured in the 2021 International Transport Forum report, we had the highest road fatalities per capita, and we're just one of 3 nations whose road deaths increased during the pandemic. That's not an impressive record. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Moulton. I now recognize Mr. LaMarfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the things we're seeing a mass increase is the proliferation of marijuana use as more and more states attempt to legalize it, even though it's still against federal law. And that affects driving. You know, we're hearing anecdotally a lot about the states, the initial states like Colorado and Washington, but as it spreads out from there, we're seeing much more responsible driving on the influence of marijuana. During the COVID-19 situation, more drivers involved in crashes with serious injuries or fatalities had THC in their system rather than alcohol, okay? It was present in 32.7% of these crashes. Alcohol was present in 28.3%. So we don't really have clear enough standards as to what impaired driving is with marijuana is. We do have 32 states, such as my home state of California, which completely leave the burden of proof for THC's influence on drivers up to the drivers on a case-by-case basis. 12 states have adopted zero tolerance laws, and 6 more have bans on certain concentrations of THC. Colorado seemingly the loosest on that. So when we're talking highway safety and more of this loose view of marijuana being for medicinal uses, what kind of level of danger do we see as this being a bigger factor of one that maybe goes less detected than alcohol, for example, to the risky behavior we're having on our highways and these numbers going up? Ms. Williams, would you like to take a stab at that?
I think it's that's important on a couple of levels. You know, we've got the safety concern of being able to detect whether someone's under the influence currently.
Little louder, please, a little closer.
Sorry. Important on a couple of levels. You know, we need the ability to be able to detect impairment at the time. But from my standpoint, and several of our ATSA members, it's an issue of hiring people who can pass the drug test to work because we're regulated by the DOT in safety-sensitive positions. So it immediately knocks workforce members out.
Yeah, we're seeing more and more complaints by people hiring truckers or anywhere else of people that can pass a test because we have such a proliferation of marijuana being quote-unquote legalized by the states. And so, but as we pursue all these measures on traffic safety, how effective are they going to be with the continued proliferation of marijuana as it keeps being legalized?
I just think that if states are going to continue to pass the medicinal marijuana, I think our DOT at the federal level needs to look at their regulations that's going to help our members.
Okay, thank you. Now, when we shift this back over to the previous discussion on rural highways and rural traffic safety, there's a lot by urban legislators speaking about, you know, more and more bike paths, bike lanes, rail, and all this and all that, and that just doesn't happen in rural areas. The people riding bicycles are doing it primarily for weekend or exercise or you know, things that are more, I guess, just not normal commuting, not the normal work, or mom going to town getting groceries or the commute to work. So how do you dedicate more space, more areas towards rural roads when it's already a challenge as it is to get them funded and gear more and more towards bicycles or pedestrians when it isn't practical for people to travel that kind of distance anyway for normal activities other than recreation? Do you take a stab at Mr. Ludwig?
I would reflect back to the prior congressman's comments about connectivity. What we have seen and what studies have shown, even in some rural areas, suburban areas in particular, providing transportation alternatives, a full spectrum of options for transportation participants is critical. My experience isn't in rural communities, so I suspect that I may not be speaking to your community, but what I have seen living in the DC suburbs, having been a city council member, planning commission member, and regional member of Transportation Planning Board locally, is that the more options you provide the transportation community with, the greater the reduction in stress on the transportation system.
I appreciate that. It's options are nice, but again, they have to be, there's a practical end use, and when it's a rural situation, it's much different than what you can do in a short commute in an urban area. And so when we talk about, the statement was made that there's too much money going towards highways and highway lanes, that's couldn't be farther from the truth in rural use, because people are very limited on these alternates. As they're not going to put high-speed rail in my counties in Northern California. They're not going to put really any rail unless it can go on an existing track, which you run into freight trains versus that. Anyway, I'm over my time, Madam Chair, but we have to look differently at how rural is in a real sense, not just options, because the options are very, very narrow for rural people on those long distances.
And I would just follow up and add, and I appreciate the question. The last big funding bill, 80% went to highways, 20% went to pedestrian bicycle improvements. So the funding is there, it's how it's being used on various ends. So I would just share that for the record.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Cahaley, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Aloha, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis. Mahalo for holding this hearing to focus on traffic safety and on building safer roads for us all. Traffic fatalities happen in every community across America, including mine, Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District. Kaulana Werner was 19 years old and was killed on Farrington Highway, a state highway, in front of his home in Nanakuli on the island of Oahu, where decades of divestment meant that there was no safe sidewalks for pedestrians. This tragedy plays over every day, especially in underserved communities like his. We know that indigenous communities and rural communities continue to have disproportionately high traffic fatalities because of the lack of infrastructure and focus on underserved communities in those investments. This problem continues to grow in Hawaii as well. And in my home state, traffic fatalities have increased 45% from 2021 to 2022, and Hawaii consistently has one of the highest per capita pedestrian fatality rates and an even higher elderly pedestrian death rate. Although Hawaii has decreased its per capita pedestrian fatality rate in recent years, there's more work that needs to be done. We know that there must be increased investment in underserved communities so that we can prioritize planning and investment in safety to neighborhoods that have had decades of divestment. And while the federal government and the U.S. Department of Transportation has embraced a new path forward on roadway design to reduce traffic fatalities, we know that more must be done. I guess my question would be directed to either Ms. Clegg or Mr. Wilson. Interested in your perspective on under-resourced communities, such as indigenous or rural communities, which have some of the highest per capita traffic fatality rates, and how can we better serve the needs of those communities, and what are you seeing in Louisiana or other communities that are underserved or often misrepresented?
Thank you for that question. I was just talking about this issue with Ed Sniffen from your state at a meeting in Dallas. What state DOTs can do is provide technical assistance to those underserviced and undersourced communities and assist them in the planning, delivery, and the operations after it's built using the best practices and the things that we know that are happening. I call your attention to the Safe Streets for All program that state DOTs are not eligible to receive, but in my state and other states, and I've shared this with Ed Sniffen, as I said, we are supporting and helping those communities write the grants and build the capacity to be able to make the investments, and then we'll support them in the proper structuring and bidding of that project. The other piece that we do is when it comes to looking at the resources that are allocated in IIJA, we are exceeding the 15%, for example, on bridges, and are going to be spending about 30% on those bridges that are outside of my program and outside of my authority. Whether it's the road transfer program that we are divesting or the local road assistance program, we would love to be able to make more investments, because regardless of what road you're on, if a kid dies on it, it's a problem. If there's a crash on it, it's a problem. And being transparent and being coordinated and collaborative in delivering infrastructure is absolutely the smart thing to do.
Thank you. Same question for Ms. Clegg. Is she on virtually?
She's not on.
She's not on, okay. You know, I guess I'll use the balance of my time to continue the conversation with Mr. Wilson. Maybe same would be said, I guess, for Louisiana. Many of Hawaii's coastal highways are right next to the ocean, are gonna suffer from climate change, are already suffering from climate change and rising sea levels. In the last 28 seconds, what's Louisiana doing to address this? Are we moving roads inland? How are we addressing it?
We are investing in a resilient infrastructure, and IIJA actually created programs that will allow states to be able to make those investments, to elevate those roads, to convert them to some other type of asset that can be used. And we're also thinking about it from a watershed perspective. And so we're spending over $1.2 billion to understand not just the sea level rise issue, but how do we manage water in general? Because we will be in a city and see roads go underwater. And so whether it's roadway elevation or improved drainage, looking at how we reinstall culverts and restore the public work elements, that's one of the things I'm most excited about in IIJA, is that it did not designate it just for one type of improvement. It's a comprehensive infrastructure investment program, and that is going to be valuable, whether you're on a bicycle lane and you have standing water at the side of the road, or you have grates that need to be converted so that you can safely ride over them, or on sidewalks. It's absolutely essential. So climate change is real, it's an impact, and it will have implications of safety in spontaneous situations when people will lose their lives, unfortunately, if we don't pay attention to it.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate the relationship between Louisiana and Hawaii and
He's trying to get me out there, and if my wife lets me, I'm going.
All right, thank you. Mahalo, Madam Chair. I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Ms. Steele for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all the witnesses coming out today. From 2020 to 2021, California saw a 10% increase in road fatalities. I'm eager to work with my colleagues to reverse this recent trend. When I was a supervisor in Orange County, I supported public service announcements to educate the public on the dangers of drunk driving and distracted driving. Mrs. Williams, how can cities and counties establish system to accommodate automated vehicles? Because there are a lot of issues of automated vehicles now that we are hearing, and a lot of lawsuits too. Can you explain how this can help make roads safer for all?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. Connected and automated vehicles are coming. The technology's here, and we're going to start seeing those changes. But we've got to remember, bottom line, we still have the human factor as well. So while there are big promises there for the technology and the advancements there, we as an industry, ATSA members, look at things such as wider pavement markings, brighter signs, smarter work zones that those connected and automated vehicles can adhere to, that they can read, that they can see, they can discern. So we look at the opportunities there.
So do you have any stats that you know what's going on and how you're going to prevent and others?
I'm sorry, do I have any statistics?
Stats, the numbers of all these lawsuits and numbers of accidents and other stuff.
Okay, I'm sorry. No, I don't have that information, but I'd be happy to get that to you in writing.
Great, thank you. How can the construction industry, vehicle and technology manufacturers, state Department of Transportations, and local governments can work together to solve mutual challenges?
I think it's important that they all collaborate together. The strategic highway safety plans with each state allow the opportunity for the state, local, tribal, county governments to work with one another to know better what issues are out there and how they can work together to develop programs.
Do you have the system that, you know, it's all connected from the federal government to the state to local government? Any system that it's been already built?
I'm not aware of a system, but I will research that and get back to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And I yield back.
All right, we hear call next Ms. Johnson of Texas.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Chairwoman Norton and Ranking Member Davis, for holding this hearing. And I'd like to thank our witnesses. This has been a very interesting hearing. I did have a question that was asked for me to ask from my Texas Department of Transportation. And I've had to go in and out, and I hope it has not been asked. But Councilwoman Clegg stated that the federal measures and designs rely too heavily on cars throughout any throughput measures. What changes need to be made for these metrics, and can they be implemented without significantly slowing traffic? And then, Councilwoman Clegg, you cited your state's local highway technical assistance council as a model for how to get more federal and state resources to places that desperately need assistance. Could you elaborate on the model of which you speak and what lessons learned from other states that we might be able to glean some direction from?
Thank you very much, Representative, and I'm sorry I lost connection for a while, but happy to be back. In Idaho, we have by state statute, have formed what we call the Local Highway Technical Assistance Council. And because of that statutory authority, it is a council that has a board of local officials, including county, city, and highway district officials that lead it. And that direct tie to those local governments allows it to better understand and better coordinate with how to get the federal money and the federal programs into the local communities and use them efficiently and effectively. In Idaho, we use that council only for the small urban and rural dollars. The large urban dollars go through the MPOs, as they do through many other states in the country. But I do believe it's been a very successful model in allowing local governments access to planning money, access to money that otherwise would be very difficult for them to write a grant to get without that help.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my home state of Texas leads the country in vehicle-related fatalities with 4,480 deaths in 2021. And although these numbers are impacted by the state's large population, it is still an issue of concern and demands more attention from our Department of Transportation. Like so many negative statistics, traffic fatalities have a disproportionate impact on communities of color. In my congressional district, the city of Dallas is working to address the issue of safety and accessibility to transportation by reconnecting and revitalizing communities historically harmed by the construction of the highway system and other barriers. But there's still a lot of work to be done in ensuring equity in our transportation system, especially in my home state of Texas. I am pleased that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included funding for several roadways. I look forward to learning if these programs are working and what else can Congress do to help the Transportation Committee attempt to continue to address troubling increases in some of these fatalities. Anyone can comment on that.
Representative Johnson, Sean Wilson from Louisiana. I will tell you, every state has infrastructure potentially that has disproportionately impacted communities of color or low-income communities, and we're excited to see the investment in IIJA for the reconnecting communities. I will tell you, it's certainly not enough to do our due justice and due diligence with regards to making a full investment, because these projects are going to be 8 to 10 years in the making. We will need additional dollars and commitment, and I would support full funding of these projects if we are serious about restoring the communities to the condition they were. It also allows us to make good investment in asset management to better maintain the systems that are built as a priority, and then most importantly, to continue to make investments where we can to ensure that those communities are protected and have the same opportunities for sidewalks and other elements to be able to move effectively if that is their option. There may not be a position or potential for them to drive or have cars. So we are committed as an association, as a state, to making that happen.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I now recognize Mr. Strawber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Norton and Ranking Member Lamalfa. Unfortunately, my district and constituents are all too familiar with unsafe roads and avoidable traffic incidents. Highway 8 runs through southern portion of my district, cutting across Chisago County. Local stakeholders, including myself, have been advocating for the Highway 8 project for years. Recently, the corridor has becoming increasingly strained due to increased commuter traffic, more commercial traffic, and recreational traffic. On top of that, over the years, more secondary roads have been added as direct access points to the highway, making it even less safe. Over the last 10 years, more than 1,100 crashes have occurred on the highway, including 7 fatalities and 12 serious injuries. With a projected 30% increase in traffic between now and 2040, I cannot stress enough the importance of safety improvements along Highway 8. We have been advocating for a 4-lane conversation and a raised median to improve safety and ultimately save lives. With every local stakeholder in support and rowing in the same direction, it has been disappointing in the past that the DOT has not granted important funding to the project. As a member of this committee and someone who has personally seen the dangers of this stretch of road, I will continue to fight for funding for this important project and push the DOT to understand that rural America matters too. I do have a question. Do you all agree that traffic enforcement helps with safe roads? Is there anybody that disagrees with that statement? Does traffic enforcement help keep our roads safe? I see you're all nodding. Okay. I just spoke to a chief of police, texted him. In a Midwest community, middle size, traffic stops on average 2 years ago were 22,000 traffic stops per year in his community. Last year, traffic stops went down to 8,000 traffic stops in the year. That's a 14,000 difference in traffic stops. You all just agreed that traffic enforcement helps with roadway safety. The chief explained in the text to me that it was because of defunding the police and not having support or potential support if you do make a traffic stop and something happens. Sheriff Nels asked you all if you thought defunding the police diminished the safety on the roads. In this particular case, if I asked you on this Midwestern small town, a reduction of 14,000 traffic stops in the year, would you say that diminished the safety or enhanced the safety of those roads?
Representative, I'd like to address that if I could.
Sure.
I would tell you this, the city of Boise has actually increased our funding for our police. We've done that because we've recognized that community policing, which requires much more proactive, hands-on, on the street policing, is the most effective strategy, we believe, for policing overall. As part of that, we've also seen a reduction in traffic stops. We've seen that reduction because our patrol officers are no longer sitting trying to make traffic stops. They're proactively engaging community members, and we believe preventing the need for those traffic stops to begin with.
I will just say,
in our case, the reduction in enforcement actually has accompanied an increase in funding.
Ma'am, I will
for
just
our
say that in Boise, the community policing effort obviously is successful. That doesn't happen
think
across the nation. That doesn't happen across the nation. And I asked, in this particular case, in this Midwestern town with a reduction of 14,000 traffic stops in 1 year, does that make the roads less safe or more safe? And I think I don't want to belabor this point. I appreciate everything you've done. I was a city councilor, a county commissioner, police officer, and now I'm privileged to serve Minnesota's 8th Congressional District. I vehemently disagree with your answers on the defunding the police. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes. You are recognized, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Chair Holmes Norton and Ranking Member Davis for today's hearing. Improving roadway safety is a top priority for me and leaders in South Florida. Every year, nearly 4,000 Floridians lose their lives in traffic accidents. More than 300 of those fatalities occurred on South Florida roads. Last year alone, Florida saw a 12% increase in fatal accidents. Just 2 weeks ago, a pedestrian and 2 bicyclists were fatally struck on Miami's Biscayne Boulevard and the Rickenbacker Causeway. Programs administered by the FHWA and NHTSA are crucial to safety efforts in our community. Just as local leaders like Mayor Levine Carver are ramping up safety efforts, Congress and the Biden administration must do the same. That's why I fought so hard alongside President Biden and congressional leaders to deliver more than $18 billion with a B to Florida to support infrastructure projects, including those improving roadway safety. I hope to work with my colleagues and stakeholders to make additional investments to make Florida's roads safer. With that, I have a few questions. Mr. Hathaway, the part of I-95 that includes the Little River and the Golden Glades interchange are some of the deadliest stretches of road in Florida. As transportation director for the city of Orlando, your Vision Zero Action Plan resulted in a double-digit reduction in fatalities. Can you highlight ways that FHWA and FDOT can further collaborate using the safe system approach to improve road safety in South Florida?
Yes, ma'am, I'd be happy to speak to that. Shifting from just focusing on reducing crashes to focusing on the corridors where the most fatalities and serious injuries is the strategy that Florida DOT is now taking. We're working with 2 of the districts in Florida right now to help them identify their high injury network. And as I mentioned earlier, if you can identify those corridors, for example, we had almost 80% of our fatalities and serious injuries are occurring on a segment of roadway in our Southeast District, which was also the home for many folks that are in communities of concerns. And the DOT is moving in this direction. They're moving in the direction of adopting a safe systems approach, which is why we've been doing training in these districts. And so I believe that that's what's necessary in all of Florida is for DOT to work with local agencies to focus on those corridors where the most fatalities and serious injuries are taking place, and then take the tools that are in the federal highways countermeasures of proven and effective treatments to address those concerns.
Thank you very much. Ms. Clegg, I represent many small cities who disproportionately struggle with addressing roadway safety and their infrastructure needs. Can you highlight the importance of increasing transportation support to small cities? Ms. Clegg?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I couldn't find my unmute button. Yes.
Can you hear me?
I don't think she heard the initial question.
I apologize. Smaller cities and countermeasures are very important. The FHWA has identified a number of countermeasures, and using them systematically in small cities has proven to work. But as Mr. Hadaway talked about, the real key to this is identifying the networks and the corridors, and not just doing one measure in one location, but looking at the whole system and using all of the measures that fit in that system to make that small city safer.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wilson, state agencies that receive highway safety improvement program funding are required to have approved comprehensive and data-driven strategic highway safety plans. I agree that there is a need for a commitment to transportation equity. As you know, I proudly sponsor the Transportation Equity Act, which will help address transportation equity issues. What additional resources are needed for states to make strides towards transportation equity?
So with specific regard to data and management, the one thing I think that's needed is consistency in policies. I think there is some potential conflict, and we're working with Federal Highways to reconcile the points between highway safety plans and the state improvement plans as a result of IIJA, so that we can have a consistent expectation of what's deliverable. The second thing with regards to equity, I think the most important thing is having an obvious framework that can be consistently applied in a state that respects the uniquenesses of that state. So for Louisiana, I don't expect the same statistics or elements of equity to apply as they would perhaps in Idaho or some other Western state, but the framework of identifying those categories and those sectors and then applying practices where there's voids, I think that is the best possible way to ensure consistency of safety measures from an equity standpoint across communities. It needs to be reflective of that state and the populations that they serve.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now call on Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question will be to the President of the Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, Mr. Wilson. If you don't mind, Secretary Wilson, I introduced HR 1967, which will allow Puerto Rico to issue commercial driver's license to commercial trucks drivers. And I know you as a Secretary of Transportation, you know how important it is, and having up to 80 hours of classroom time, third-party testing, driving hours, and written test, and additional schooling, driving and education for the 6 additional endorsements for driving. Given the numbers of deaths that occur on the roads each year, isn't it essential that commercial drivers have their CDLs, which raise equality in drivers' standards at the same time?
I had a hard time hearing, but I think the question was around the consistency of the qualifications and training necessary for CDLs. And I think absolutely that training is essential. I think it needs to be updated and modernized based on what we're seeing in our system, whether it has to do with technologies or new design elements or other factors that will contribute to safety. And so I'm not sure if I missed the core element of your question. It was a little hard to hear. So if I haven't, if you could maybe succinctly state that, and I'll give it another attempt.
Thank you for your answer. But I'm asking, we filed a bill, HR 1967, which will allow Puerto Rico to have their own commercial driver's license for commercial truck drivers. We don't have that. And I was explaining to you, in your experience, how important this is for education, the testing, and the hours of classroom time that may allow to reduce the fatalities in roads. And given this, do you think this will allow to raise the quality of drivers? This kind of CDLs, if it's allowed in Puerto Rico?
Representative Gonzalez, I will tell you I'm not familiar with the language in HR 1967, and I will make sure that we supply a written answer after reviewing the text of that to give you a position from AASHTO.
The next question, we'll do it to Mr. Gaines, the Executive Director of the Washington Bicyclist Association. And I was reading the guide list of the DC Bike Law Pocket Guide, and it's following. It says cyclists have the right to ride with traffic. There is no law that requires cyclists to ride on the right side of the road. Cyclists must yield to the right way to pedestrians. However, cyclists must be treated as a pedestrian in the crosswalk. It's legal for cyclists to split lanes, riding between traffic. There's no regulation that say a bike lane must be utilized when provided. Cyclists are allowed to ride on the sidewalks, except in the central district. Cars cannot be parked in the bike lane. It's legal to be on your phone while riding a bicycle, among many others. And my question will be, should we, and please clarify to me, should we spend significant amount of taxpayers' money for bike lanes when they're optional, even if they're provided?
What's the question? Should we be?
Sorry?
I'm sorry. I was attempting to follow. The audio wasn't the best. Should we? I'm struggling a little bit with understanding your prescriptive there. Should we be doing what for cyclists?
Can you hear me now, sir?
I can actually read the monitor better. So as you talk, that helps. Thank you.
My question will be, should we spend significant amount of taxpayers' money for bike lanes when they are optional, even when they are provided?
Well, the question about spending taxpayer dollars for bike lanes is a question about being a very sound and solid investment in our transportation infrastructure. It is clear when there are options, and they are dedicated options, they are protected lanes, they are set aside for cyclists to use, that they should be used by cyclists, and that when we do have those lanes utilized within our infrastructure, we are seeing the benefits tremendously throughout our community. There are safer commutes for cyclists, safer commutes for pedestrians, and safer commutes and barriers for vehicular traffic, separating the two, bicyclists and vehicles. As far as the investments, yes, absolutely. It is money very well spent. And
Sir,
thank you.
Sir, I support bike lanes. I was just making my question. My time is up, in terms of why, if they're optional there and they're provided, it is optional for the cyclist to decide whether to use it or not. But thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I'm not familiar right away with the specific language that you quoted, but I will say that where you have areas of non-connectivity, as good as DC has gotten and grown with connecting bike lanes along different arterials, there will be opportunities where bike lanes don't exist, and you'll have to take alternate routes to connect to another bike lane. So I suspect that may speak to that, but what I will say is I'll look into that and speak with staff back at our office about that specific question, and I'm more than happy to follow up with you and present that information.
Thank you, sir.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I call on Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To all witnesses, in my district, we have over 50,000 trucks and 160 trains going through it daily. The major safety problems are the interaction with freights and cars and bicycles and pedestrians. And I am proud that the infrastructure law included billions for freight program to mitigate the impact freight has on local communities and highway rail crossings, great separations. There are special interests who want federal freight funding to go directly for freight without addressing the impacts rail has on local communities. Do you believe federal freight funding should be spent on mitigating safety, air quality, and congestion impacts of freight, and what more can be done to address this grade crossing separation safety?
I didn't hear the question, and the text stopped on the monitor. So if you could maybe restate the question.
Special interests want federal freight funding to go directly to freight without addressing the impacts freight has on local communities. And do you believe federal freight funding should be spent on mitigating safety, air quality, and congestion impacts on freight? And what more can be done to address highway rail grade crossing safety?
So I think the question was around special interest and rail and other elements of investing in safety, whether it's railroad crossings. Absolutely, I think we owe it from a safe systems approach to make the investments in safety wherever it may be. And so we do support those investments. In my state, we have a grade separation program. We've got multimodal connector programs. We're also investing from a commercial trucking standpoint to advocate for elements of safety for the commercial trucking units, particularly at our ports and points of entry for freight into the marketplace. So those investments ought to be equally distributed. When I say equally distributed on those issues, but we should be making those advancements because they do play a major part in ensuring that the travelers and vulnerable users are safe who may live in communities adjacent to those as well from a climate standpoint. We owe it to make those appropriate investments.
Well, my district has the Alameda Corridor East, and that has all the major traffic from the ports, Long Beach and Los Angeles, going to deliver to the rest of the nation. And it's highly, highly used. And so it's important for the people because I have sat at a railroad crossing for half an hour waiting for a train that carries over 200 rail cars waiting to cross. And you have road rage, you have people trying to get through, and it's just a mess.
We have a very similar situation, but I will tell you, as a state that has all of the Class 1 railroads operating in them, several communities deal with that impact. And also as a state in the Southeast that has adopted a climate action plan, clearly freight has a role in ensuring environmental soundness in terms of what we do, but it also deals with lives and people because they do allow us to get trucks off the road. And so having a good conversation and relationship with our freight partners means being sensitive to what's happening in those communities. There are things that they're doing that are a part of our daily lives, and that disruption is challenging. It is difficult, and technology can be our friend in terms of noticing and advising individuals when trains are forthcoming and the length of those trains and how long they'll be. And so communicating and coordinating with the rail industry is absolutely essential, I think, in ensuring a good quality of life in addition to a safe life as well.
Have you dealt with the railroad?
I have had good relationships with all of the railroads, some better than others, but I would tell you it's a universal experience that they've been around a lot longer than many of our highway systems, no different than what happens in the maritime space. But I'll be happy to work with you and share the numbers for the friends who do return our calls and are quick to respond to us, and each of them are, in fact.
Well, we gave them the land, and now they don't want to allow for things to happen to promote this kind of safety. I'm sure that we should have something in the works to help mitigate that with the railroads, because we should have the public safety before profit.
Absolutely, and whether it's safety in terms of climate or safety in terms of mobility and actual vehicles on the road, it's absolutely the part of it. And we just can't lose sight that we rely on that freight industry, and we rely on those ports, and we rely on those trains to deliver everything to us. Everything that we own, buy, sell, or trade has been on the back of a truck or a train or in the hull of a ship, and it's a part of a continuum of service. But coordinating and communicating is absolutely essential. And so I would agree with you that they have an obligation to be good citizens and good neighbors, just as we do to them as good businesses.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And this concludes our hearing. I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. Your comments have been very informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection so ordered, the subcommittee stands adjourned.